Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Adam Levine. I am the director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies here at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. For those of you who are not already on our newsletter list, please do sign up for our newsletter to hear about other events that we'll have throughout the year, including, for those students in the room, our upcoming Hack for Humanity event, which may be an exciting opportunity in October for you to take part in. Our Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies has a mission of bringing together scholars and practitioners from around the globe to work out some of the most pressing challenges in the humanitarian and human rights space and identify solutions to those challenges in collaboration with local communities around the world. And today we are very, very excited to have with you our current Fulbright scholar, Dr. Siautu Alefaio-Tugia, who is a Pacific Professor of Psychology at the University of Otago in New Zealand. As a scholar-practitioner, Siautu uses her 20 years of psychology practice and research to shine a light on cultural ways of knowing and being that push psychology out of the box. Her work in family violence, humanitarian response, and disaster resilience focus on the Pacific diaspora as key mobilizers in climates of change. Previously, she spent over a decade working at the School of Psychology at Massey University and served as Associate Dean for the Pacific in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. She was a Rutherford Discovery Fellow and has also for many years been a Global Fellow of our own Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. And so we were really lucky to be able to have her here in person with us today. I'm going to invite her up now to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A where all of you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please, as she speaks, be thinking of your questions, and we will be taking them as soon as she finishes speaking. I apologize that our lunch is running late. We do have lunch for all of you, but you'll have to get it as you exit. You can take it to go after this talk. So without further ado, I will invite up Siautu to come speak. Thank you so much.
Tūhia ki te rangi, tūhia ki te whenua, tūhia ki te ngākau o ngā tangata. Ko te me nui, ko te aroha. Tihei mauri ora. Write it in the sky. Write it in the land. Write it in the hearts of people. The greatest thing is love. This is life. Tulo nā lava. Le pe ia ma le malu au fia le nei fo ia uli. Le Sū Sungapolo Professor Adam Levine, a Massey le Center of Human Rights, my Humanitarian Studies. I le nei au fia o Watson Institute, Brown University. Tangata le nei ele Narragansett, whawhtai te le lava. I greet you all in the mother tongue of my birthplace, where I was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then with my own mother tongue, Samoan. I thank Professor Adam Levine, the Center of Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, Watson Institute here at Brown University, for hosting me. And I acknowledge the First Peoples of this land, Narragansett, for the ancestral homelands on which I stand. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a little bit about the paradise from which I come. I don't know about you, but when you think of the Pacific or Pacific Islands, what I've garnered now and understood in America is that we are not necessarily categorized, but understood as Pacific Islanders. And I'm trying to get that R at the end so you can understand me a bit better. So Pacific Islander, I understand, falls within the Asian American Pacific Islander sort of categorization. So when I refer to Pacific as a term, I'm also referring to Pacific Islanders for here in America, just so we can get that translation straight as I'm going through and you're not sitting here being confused about who I'm referring to. So when you think of a Pacific person or a Pacific Islander, who or what comes to mind for you? Anyone? Yeah?
Low-lying countries facing rising oceans.
Nice, nice. Any person?
Dwayne Johnson.
I had to have someone who would get that, right? And so when we think of the rock of Polynesia, it's not just Niue, one of the atolls in the Pacific. We're also thinking about our brother rock, who's made, I guess, Polynesian a place, a name, an area that people understand and know now through his movies, Moana, even in that, I think it was like a Fast and Furious spin-off where he had his brothers come to Samoa. You've seen it in Hawaii. So I'm not here to talk about the rock per se, but I'm going to talk about the resilience that he basically encapsulates in a way, and how he's been able to turn things around for himself in a land that is the great land of freedom here in America. So when I think of the Pacific and the region of Pacific, I think about it in these terms because this is how we were categorized when we were discovered way back in the heyday. Polynesia, poly, many, nesia, islands. Micronesia, tiny, micro, tiny, nesia, islands again. And Melanesia, Mala, referring to the colour of skin, darker populations. And so when I think of the Pacific, I think about it being the largest ocean in the world. And one thing that struck me now being in the mainland, because I actually started my Fulbright over in Hawaii and then came to the mainland, was the amount of highways you have. And believe it or not, my husband and I, we drove, I don't know what we were thinking, but we drove into New York, and I had no idea because I was just following Google Maps, but I ended up actually driving on this George Washington State Bridge. I had no idea that this maze would freak me out so badly. And I had to think about that in relation to when we talk about or we read literature about our highways. So while your highways are the roadways, our highways in the Pacific are the ocean. And so rather than thinking of them as these small island developing states, our greatest, I guess, scholar of our time in the Pacific, Dr. Ebeli Hauofa, thinks about it as not being defined by the smallness of our islands, but rather by the greatness of our ocean. And that's what I'm here to share with you about, is how not just great the ocean is, but how great the people within the ocean are in terms of withstanding the tide that is coming up against us on the daily. And so I'm going to share with you how my journey started, and how through that I've begun to sort of really unpack what it is that resilience is for us, not just in climate change, but in climates of change. Because for us, and I guess Adam, our foray into disasters was alongside climate change. We never separated any of this. Climate change, disaster, humanitarian response, it's holistic in our way that we approach it and think it. We don't just put climate change into one box, humanitarian response into another box, and then disaster into another. Although oftentimes it's treated that way in policy. And I guess what I'm trying to kind of come to you today was thinking is how can we actually think about it in a holistic way? Because each one serves its purpose together. We're not really, but currently we're obviously coming at it segmented. And so for me in 2009, as a first responder, I was freaked out at first, thinking to myself, what am I doing here? This is not the time that psychologists come yet. And yet Samoa, the country itself, the island nation, asked New Zealand's response team for 2 Samoan-speaking psychologists. And hence I was part of the Ministry of Health response at that time. At that time, I thought that this is not the time, but actually in hindsight now, I see why we needed to go early. In terms of being Samoan, speaking, understanding, having been to Samoa previously and run a lot of basic counselling skills training for the people on the ground, I was able to feed into our psychosocial response team and create local-led responses that were actually going to be impactful thereafter. And so while the land itself and that image on the left is how bad it was when we first arrived, that is the exact road that I was on 1 year later. So you can see how fast the land itself can replenish, can restore, can recover. But the reality for people is it's not that fast at all. And that is the space that I operate in on the daily. So I'm not just operating with the physical manifestation of hurt, but most importantly, the spiritual, the aspect of the heart that no one sees, that we call mental health. And so for me, the challenge was really laid down from our former head of state, His Highness Siautu Alefaio-Tugia, when he really I always default to that, but when he encouraged us and reminded us that in terms of thinking about this disaster, how we supported each other was through our families, faith, and our humour. That actually it's these things that carry us through the most difficult of times. And so with that in mind, families first, I started to think about our diaspora. And diaspora, for Samoans especially, is huge. Because while most of us are born in Aotearoa and speak English and live in what we call the Polynesian city of the world, Auckland, otherwise also known as the city of sails, that population is what I refer to as our global village. So in Samoa, we have just under 200,000, but outside of Samoa, here in America, you have one of the largest Samoan diasporic populations globally. And so for us, in terms of family solidarity, that care and that social security that they provide for families that are going through disasters, we have to look at that diasporic population and understand who they are. The majority of us are in urban cities. The majority are the poorest of the poor. So in terms of our socioeconomic status, we earn less than other populations in those countries. We have high rates of domestic violence, high rates of prison offending, especially violent offending. And this is who our diaspora are that respond in times of disasters. So despite having the lowest socioeconomic statistics, at the other end of the spectrum, we're the fastest to respond as well. So in a sense, when it comes to humanitarian response for the Pacific, it's the poor helping the poor. And so 10 years on, in 2019, having spent that last 10 years really just working with a lot of our diaspora in the Pacific, I partnered with an organisation called Soul Samoa in celebration, I guess, or in memory of the 10 years of the tsunami. And in this arena, what we were doing is building on those people who are actually out there doing the work in the villages. So in Samoa and in the Pacific in general, they are Christian nations, and church rules the roost. Whether you like it or not, for me, it's not the issue. The issue is this is what's happening for our people, so how do we reach them? And of course it's difficult because they're very traditional. There's a lot of ways in which we have to work. So 10 years on, and finally I managed to have space to actually provide a lecture for their first, second and third year theological students, where they actually close the school down and put them all in the room, and we got to do psychological first aid with them. And so you can see the terrain that we're working with and how it is that we are trying to build into the systems of resilience. They already have knowledge that can help them continue to be prepared for when a disaster happens. And so for me, having just come back from, and sorry, I'm putting my time in here, Adam, so I can make sure that I'm on time and not over time. For me, having just come back from Samoa and landed in New Zealand, I probably was only home for maybe a couple of weeks when I had to turn around and do the measles outbreak as well. So that was September, landed back, and then like early November, the measles. So you can see here in terms of the Pacific region itself, like how many disasters have been occurring and the compounding nature of them. And while we just finished doing the measles, then the new year we had the Honga earthquake, which was the once in a lifetime volcanic eruption that then led to the tsunami, which while they didn't have as many fatalities, the number of people that were displaced was huge for Tonga. And so for me, sitting in a geoscience space, it's not my space at all, but I often get caught into these spaces. And everyone was, as scientists are, and we are people scientists, excited about this about this volcano and talking about all of the science behind it. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about the Tongan population who have not heard anything from their families because communication was down. And so if you know anything about Tonga, a satellite phone is rare. They're held by, governments who are there. So at the time it was New Zealand, Australia. But I knew that the LDS, which is the Latter-day Saints, they also had a satellite phone in Tonga based on the work that we had been doing over the years. LDS, by the way, while I'm not LDS, I don't attain to any of them, but they're actually what we call the Pacific humanitarian responders, because if you want to be safe in the Pacific, if anyone's thinking of going and something happens, just run into an LDS church, because they're the most well-built facilities across the Pacific. And so I digress. Long story short, I was sitting in this meeting, and at the end, it was like they throw the pass to the brown person in the room. And so I was the last person to speak. And they said, so we're just wondering, is there anything that you would like to say? And I asked them the question, so of all of this amazing knowledge that you've been talking about, what are the top 3 things that if this was your family and you were going to respond to them because you haven't heard from them, you would want them to know now? Silence. And then gasp, and then, we never actually thought of that. And then I said, so I'm just thinking it would be great to have the top 3 information points that you think is really relevant right now so that we can translate them. Translation. We've never done that before. Okay. And so we mobilized real fast in that week, and within 3 days we had this infographic that one of our PhD students who's looking at disaster communications, graphic designer, he pulled this together. And so this was translated into Tonga, and the organisation that we had already been working with, which is Affirming Works, oops, sorry, I'm going backwards, aren't I? They were already in Tonga. They grow coffee in Tonga. They're a social enterprise. And they were already doing boxes for COVID, food boxes for COVID in New Zealand. So they pivoted and they provided the same boxes, nothing different, put them in a container. This time they put the infographic in there so that people would know. And so the masks were there because of the volcanic ash. So a lot of the scientists were really concerned that the ash was toxic, but we had the local Tonga people who said, oh no, the ash is very good for our crops. We use the ash. And of course the scientists were like, what, really? Okay, first thing, let's get a sample of the ash. And what do you know? Came back, it wasn't toxic, it actually is really rich. And they use it as fertilizer for their crops. This is the ash. So if you're a geoscientist sitting in this room, there you go, there's another piece of good information that came from the people of the land. And this is the importance of us going back to some of the indigenous knowledges, because we can do science all around the world, but actually there's some knowledges that are located with the people of the lands that have yet to be understood and yet to come out into the light. And that is a classic example. It wasn't even something that we intentionally set out to do. It was because we were in the same room. We were at the same table. We were having conversations that together we could come up with and understand each other. And so here's the diaspora in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Tongan diaspora, this organisation packing these boxes and putting them in containers and shipping them off to Tonga, to those island nations. They already had people there. They were already using their money within Tonga to do other things in terms of responding. But these boxes from COVID were then pivoted for the Pacific. And so I guess for me, what this actually points to is the fact that in terms of psychosocial response in our cascading disasters now, because that's the era we're in, we're not going back to a one-off here and there. This is now an era of compounding, cascading disasters. And so you can see here in this timeline from 2009 right up to 22, just how many have happened. And if you didn't know about disasters, you sure knew about it with COVID. That global pandemic changed the face of disasters. I remember in 2015 when I was here with you, Adam, it would seem like a tiny bit of the global people who were in that room. And since then, it's just exploded. And now disasters in everyone's foray, everyone understands the terms that we use. It's not something that we have to sort of educate people on anymore. Responding is just part and parcel of everyday's conversation. And so when I think about it in terms of a psychological perspective, I think about it in terms of Pacific-Indigenous psychology. And what does that mean for me? It means that for peoples of the Pacific, our default position, thinking-wise internally and then in terms of our families, is always others-centered, which means the minute we think, we're thinking first about someone else. You know, and people often think, oh, how do you do that? Well, I equate that to when I was working with offenders in the prison. And you'd go through these psychological screening tools. And most often there was disengagement. They were pissed off. They were not engaging. And when I would come in and I would do my talanoa, I never started with the screening tool. I always started with who I am, where I come from, whose I am, to whom I belong. And immediately they engaged. Immediately they said, oh, yeah, okay, you're this and so-and-so's daughter. Oh, you come from that village. Oh, I remember that. Oh, that's your dad. Oh my gosh, yeah, we're related. Oh, cousin. I was like, okay, I've got to have to put this out somewhere else now. Because we connect with the others in us first. So I connect with your family first before I connect with yourself. And that's who I pay homage to when I pay homage to these lands of the Narragansett. And so in thinking about that, and I take it forward to this current humanitarian landscape, one thing that struck me when I was here in 2015 was that there's all this global money and it's running out. And if America moves out, there's going to be even less. And so I always said to Adam that sort of like really hit a chord with me in 2015, because I went back to Aotearoa, New Zealand. I was like, guys, we have to think about what we're going to do for ourselves. And then when I went into our community, they were like, well, we're already doing it anyway, so what are you talking about? We're already helping our people. You already know that. You're a remitter. You remit money to your family all the time. So what are you talking about? And that was when the light bulb moment came on, and I was like, right. So here are these visible structures in the humanitarian landscape that are really obvious. And when I went to Geneva and I looked at the Museum of Red Cross and how it came out of conflict, and it was, you know, a time and a place and a space. And then I thought about my own current landscape and how we're really removed from that. How Red Cross is constantly asking me, how can we get more volunteers at the Pacific? And I'm like, do you realize every day is a voluntary day for them? These kids are in the churches, sweeping, cleaning toilets, they are feeding their families, they're caring for their elders. This is their every day. Like, when will they have time to then come and volunteer for your organization when every day it's a voluntary day? And so for me, it was thinking about this visible climate within the humanitarian landscape and then my invisible everyday, which happened during COVID, was more prominent, which happened during the tsunami, happened in the disaster, like nearly every disaster I was attending. Who was the front line? It was the community. It was the village. It was the families. It was the remitters. It was the people like us. You think about it. In the Haitian earthquake, how much money went there in the first year? Hundreds of millions from American USAID, US aid. Underspent. 2 billion from the Haitian diaspora in that first year. The amount of diasporic aid is so invisible even now that USAID has only just got one person now looking at diasporic humanitarianism. I mean, that's phenomenal for me because we're now 2015 and it's 2024. But this is an area where I think that if you're in this room and you're at Brown, you're the next leader of your nation, this nation. You're the top 10 universities in America. America is massive. I'm not just speaking to anyone. I know who I'm speaking to. You've got an historical place of precedence. This is where leaders are made. And so you may not think that you have anything in common with the Pacific, but you've got everything in common with me. Because you come from a family, you come from a community, you come from a place and space. We may have different people that we're collecting data from. So I'm just talking about now who we've gone back to. We've gone back to our invisible populations. These are all of our Pacific providers, leaders in Aotearoa New Zealand that we have sought to understand their leadership and what happens when they're responding, their organisations are responding in humanitarian response. And we've collected a lot of data and we've created our own analysis, which we call Talanoa analysis, which sits within our own Pacific methodologies of whaafaletui. And whaafaletui is a term we use in Samoa. It's very specific, actually, where it's actually searching for wisdom from houses of collective wisdom, whereby you can represent a house of collective wisdom. Your ancestors, your peoples, these are the houses of collective wisdom. And we don't necessarily come in with surveys and interviews, we come with talanoa. And talanoa is the art of conversation or the art of cultural dialogue, where actually the things that come out are not from the questions, but obviously from the dialogue that we're having as we are interacting. And so you can see here in terms of our analysis, what we're trying to get to is the essence or the core of what people are saying, because we are also translating languages here. We're translating Samoan to English, then we're back translating. So Samoan speak in metaphor a lot of the times. So we can't just translate that word for word literally. We have to talk to our elders, we have to get an understanding, we have to think about the context, so we are translating and back translating all the time. And so basically, in terms of our preliminary findings, we're looking at what people are saying in the Pacific is that it needs to be Pacific design, led and driven. Whatever response you're doing, whatever type of landscape you're in, we need to design it, we need to lead it, or we need to drive it. Our communities, time and time again, are saying to us, don't come in here and tell us what to do. Come here, listen, and let us lead. And so I think you'll find that in terms of going forward in your own spaces and in the areas that you are commandeering, you might be thinking, oh, what can I do? And I think about all of the great leaders of America that have always said things along the lines of, well, you know what, if you're thinking, well, what could I do? Shouldn't you be asking the question, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? Because tomorrow will roll around and someone else will. But why can't that someone else be you? Because you're here and you've paid a lot of money to be here. So you might as well use what you're worth in this place to make a difference out there. And so for us, it's been about how do we go back into our communities, how do we partner well with our young ones? Because we can't just start at the university. I mean, what are your local schools here in Narragansett out there, or here in Rhode Island? What are you doing in your class that you could take to a local school, or even from the communities that you are from whatever places in America that you inhabit? We went to our local Decile 1 school here in Manurewa. They call it Rewa Hard. It has 3 what we call bilingual units. So the children learn and are immersed in their own mother tongue. So it's Samoan, then Tongan and Māori and English. So we came in here, and our research funding, we used it to build a podcast room. And why did we do that? Because we wanted our young people to start early, like use all the skills. We used our funding, I know it was a little bit, but we thought, turn this room that was like it was like a cleaning closet, had nothing in there, and now it's actually, we don't really want to tell a lot of people about it because of the cost of the equipment that's in there. So for all of the schools in Aotearoa, New Zealand, this has the top equipment, because the sound guy who came in, the sound engineer, realised who it was for, and he brought, of the 28, and I appreciate the audio person in the room will appreciate this. He took one of the these microphones that were meant for the radio station, and he put it in this room. So they've got an amazing equipment. But I'll just play a little segment from here. I'm sorry. Let me just go back to. Let me see if I can.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's Roscoe podcast.
Can you hear that?
My name is Samoan, and today we have 2 very special guests, which is Wesley Tumia and Contalo. Can we have take 2? Yeah, take 2. Come on, lady.
And so for us, it's about them. We have geoscientists from our other Quake Corps partner, which is Earthquake Resilience. We have professors, doctors, we have their local parents who are doing business come in. We have themselves, like just test running. We also had the New Zealand team who won the America's Cup. Their first podcast was actually the America's Cup team, and the kids are amazing. But it was funny because, unfortunately, where we're from in South Auckland, they'd never watched America's Cup. They'd only ever seen rugby, which is equivalent to your football. So the teachers had to do this massive job in teaching them what America's Cup was. And then, of course, when they came, it was a blast. But I just wanted to say, in closing, that I guess for me, and sorry, Adam, have I gone over? Just a little bit over. I'm really passionate about Pacific resilience, and not just climate change, but climates of change, because that's the era that we're in today. And when I went back to Samoa in 2019 in preparation for our memorial of those that we lost, because we lost just under 200 people, and so for a population of just under, well, now we're 180, 190,000. That's a lot per capita. Those are our family leaders, generational leaders. And one thing that really struck me, I guess, is how resilient our people continue to be in the face of knowing that our islands could be wiped off this whole face of the earth in years to come. And yet when you go there, you'll see people smiling, you'll see them laughing, you'll see them roll out food for you. They have no, they're not thinking about, losing their homes. They're just thinking about how grateful they are that you're there. And this song represents that for me.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, I thank you for attending. I thank you for listening. And I really do hope that seeds sown today will generate massive amounts of impact in your own communities. I'm not here to tell you which side of the climate change divide you should be on. I'm just here to share with you my story. I've got a little bit of sweets for you from New Zealand. I'm really sorry if you are allergic to peanuts, but peanut slabs is all I have with me, so I will pass this out as we go into our panel. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Siautu, for joining us, and that was really such a wonderful talk. And, you know, I loved several of the points that you made in the talk. I teach a course this semester called Human Security and Humanitarian Response here at the Watson Institute. And, you know, one of the slides at the beginning of the course that I show all my students is this exponential increase in humanitarian disasters that we have been seeing over the past few decades. And that is especially driven by climatologic and meteorologic disasters such as storms, tsunamis, and flooding, etc., driven by climate change. And so what I tell my students is that no matter what we do right now, much of this is baked in to the climate for the remainder of this century. So for the remainder of everyone's lives here, we're going to be living in an era of disasters, as you mentioned. And people talk a lot in the humanitarian community about vulnerability, and they talk about how, you know, the Pacific Islands are, you know, the majority of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world are in the Pacific in terms of vulnerability to disaster. But I like the way that you flip it and talk about resilience. And I think that we spend a lot of time in the humanitarian world figuring out who is most vulnerable and not enough time figuring out what resilience exists and how we can actually build that resilience and spread it and strengthen it. And one of the areas of resilience you particularly talked about with the Pacific is the diaspora. There's a lot of talk now, really just in the last few years, about how we can involve local communities more in disaster response, which is always funny because they have always been the first responders to disasters, but in particular how we can fund local communities better through the international system. But almost nobody talks about the diaspora and how we can better utilize the diaspora in responding to disasters and emergencies. And, you know, from your perspective, if the UN system, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN-OCHA, for instance, and the other agencies like UNHCR and WHO and UNICEF wanted to tap into this power of the diaspora better, wanted to work more closely with the diaspora, how could they do this? What would you encourage them to do in order to, you know, make better use of this and to better coordinate with this, you know, powerful community that they really aren't right now?
I think for me in America, the first step would be to actually, sorry, I'll turn this off.
Oh, actually, if you have that, that's probably fine.
Okay. I think for me here in America, the first thing would be to approach your local churches. Because wherever the Pacific go, the reason they build churches or inhabit churches is because it's a village. It represents for them the villages from where they left. And so despite what we might think of church leaders, those are the people who actually have the sway in the communities for the diaspora. So having them on board, even if they might not be the ones that are mobilizing, they can put you in touch with the people who are mobilizing. I saw in Australia just recently over the last 2 days that they had the first Samoan pastoral leaders conference. And I thought, gee, I'd love to hit that one up. Or even just to have Australia's foreign affairs in there somewhere, you know, because those are the people you really need to kind of get on side.
One of the, well, I should say, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to all of you. So hopefully all of you have questions ready, and Tristan will be coming around with microphones to hand to you. One other question that I had is, related to this power of the diaspora, but also considering the inequities that that might create, in the sense that within a population, let's say on a Pacific island, the members of that population who have family in the diaspora that can send them money are likely to be, perhaps already, I would imagine, some of the wealthier or upper or middle class members of society, and the poorest members of society may be those who don't have family abroad to send money. What has your experience been with sort of remittances from abroad in disaster? Does that money tend to go to specific parts of the population, or is it spread more equitably across the population affected by disaster?
I think my experience is that because it's going families to families, if you're in a village, those families that have received, they're always sharing anyway. So even if your family's not remitting, the family that's received has already taken care of the other families. So because, for example, in Samoa, it's a village society, this family might be receiving something, but you'll always see them give to the next family and the next family. So the only times where we're seeing now a new class of poor that's coming up is when families have been banished from certain villages. And now we're seeing organisations that are standing up in the Pacific that are actually being able to support those. Different across every island nation. So Fiji will be very different to Samoa, be very different to Tonga. Tonga has a monarchy, a king, and so that's altogether different as well. So despite the differences, though, what I've seen across the Pacific is that people are always sharing their resources. Yeah. So at one time, the messaging for the Tonga Tonga earth volcano was, don't give just anything, give money. And the remittance people were, the community, like, don't tell us what we can give. We'll just go and fill up we don't care, we're just going to fill up those containers with whatever we have, right? Because the art of giving doesn't determine what you can give, right? And people just want to give whatever. And so from a logistics perspective, the humanitarian landscape goes, oh no, you're filling up all of the ports with this stuff that's not being used. But the Tongan families themselves were saying, oh no, we're going to use that. It might not be for this disaster, but actually what they end up doing, and people think they're stockpiling, but you'll see years later, they're selling that stuff on the street. So people are very resourceful. And I think the determination of what we give also needs to be thought in that light. We can't determine what they should be giving just because of the logistics we're seeing in places. We actually have to be listening to that community because they're repurposing. I mean, repurpose was a word that they were born into. You'll see it everywhere you go. They repurpose tires, they repurpose nails from buildings that were torn down. Like, everything has got it might not be now, but it could be in 2 years' time. So yeah, nothing is wasted over there. Yeah.
Right. Well, I want to open it now to questions from the audience. So please, I guess in the back there.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I hope you could hear me.
Sure.
Thank you for the lecture. Very fascinating, very interesting. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology. I actually have two questions, kind of related to theory and practice, I suppose. Earlier, you had sort of showed this formulation of the foundation, the Fa'a Samoa. Could you maybe just talk a little bit how the environment or how nature is sort of conceptualized? I know these are very like Western standards I'm using here, but I see culture, space, place, time, language. This seems to sort of indicate an environment, but how is it conceptualized? You know, are we stewards? Are we being impacted by the environment, which seems to be a rather Western notion? And my other question is more practice related. You mentioned this sort of 10-year timeline it sort of took to, I guess, build rapport. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about what that resistance or hesitation was, what you think it was, and maybe some of the benefits of that delay? Thank you.
Sure. Firstly, to the question about Samoa, I think for me it was trying to understand our place and our way of thinking. So cosmologically, in terms of cosmology, that's kind of our way of conceptualizing the world, in that we think of everything as one, right? So in terms of Samoa itself, the Samoa, the premise is on anga nu'u, which anga is the nature and nu'u, village. So it's the nature of being village. And what is village? It's the nature of being together with your families. So in terms of the way that we think about land, like for example, land, I'll only speak on Samoa because that's what I know and where I come from. So probably just under 90% of Samoa land is what we call family titled land. It's not owned by any private owner, it's owned by families. So my name that I was titled with almost 10 years ago, and which I resisted at the time, not realizing what my parents were trying to do, is Le'ena. So even though they gave me Siautu, when I went back to Samoa, they bestowed the title Le'ena. Le'ena is from a village called Fagamalo in Sava'i, and that means if I go to Sava'i and I want to build a house, I can do it. Because that name, Le'ena, is a title name in Fagamalo, and I can go back, but that house is not my house. That house is for our family. So I can build it, I can leave it, I don't own it, our family own it. And that's how Samoa think about land. Land is family titled land. So you'll see, I don't know, no, you wouldn't have seen, in my little world, the last maybe 2 to 3 years, there's been this proliferation of what we call Matai bestowal titles. In one village alone, there was literally almost 200. That's never been done. And this is what we're seeing in terms of the diaspora and the people of the land who are wanting to ensure that the ancestral names continue through the generations, because it means that we can still contribute to our land. So because my title is Le'ena, I pay what we call a mo'ongakanga. So this is a contribution, it's not a fee, but it's something that I contribute to the village, to my family there in Fagamalo, which is the Whaamoe family. So we've got prima place by the sea, by the way, it's paradise. But that's how we think about land. Land is not owned by an individual, it's owned by the family. And so how we utilize land, how we protect the land, because it's land that nurtures us, it's land that feeds us. It's the environment that we have to understand. Like that's why for us, we have that special relationship, because we know that if we don't treat the land well, we're going to go hungry tomorrow. And so in terms of the second question, can you just remind me again? Sorry, it was about...
just like the 10 years sort of took to build the
right,
and what they were resisting and maybe some of the benefits of that timeline.
Well, the other side to Samoa is because we're very church-oriented and very traditional in our ways, and in terms of the leadership, it takes time to really kind of unpack the relationship with them. And I'm a pastor's kid, by the way, and I can sort of go in there and give them the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it may not necessarily be received in such a way because of all our protocols. And of course, there's a big religiosity there that we have to break barriers over. So the way in which we do that is coming through psychological first aid, is that's more receptive. Psychosocial response, disaster response, humanitarian response, that's more well received. Hope that kind of answers your question.
Questions, let's see. We have over here and over here. So why don't we start here and then we'll go there next.
Hi there, thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm a geosciences student. I study climate and biology, and so I was really interested in your point about geoscientists sharing this excitement about a volcanic eruption that then didn't translate to helpful, sort of relevant information to families responding to disaster. So I guess I'm curious about what you think the responsibility of the scientific community, especially with climate scientists and people concerned with endemic island biodiversity like myself, what the responsibility of the scientific community to temper our excitement or sort of focus only on non-human life and biodiversity, and how we can best communicate that respectfully and balance it with like attention to human community resilience?
Yeah, great question. I think I don't want to minimize the excitement because everything is always exciting to me, you know. But how we can actually take that excitement and the exciting information and then translate that. I think for me the key is translation. How do you translate that information into information that's going to be impactful? Impactful for the people that are actually on the receiving end, impactful for communities, and impactful for you. So I always think, ask yourself, if this was my family, if I'm trying to translate something to my family, how would I best do that? How would I best help them to understand what I'm really excited about?
I think we'll make this the last question so that people have time to actually get the food outside, which is there now, before you go on to your next event. And again, I'm sorry that we didn't have the food at the beginning, but I am sure Siautu will be happy to stay
Sure.
here afterwards if others have questions and want to come up and ask her those questions. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. So I just had a question around methodology. So you shared a little bit about Talanoa and the way in which it's a Pacific-oriented methodology that's based in community values and approaches. And I guess I wondered, you know, there's a lot of difference within the Pacific and a lot of similarities because it's such a vast space. And so how those kind of methodologies that you employ working with communities in Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, maybe in, you know, Aotearoa, et cetera, like it's different, but it's similar. So how do some things carry over maybe and some things might not? You know, the church, et cetera, is more present in some spaces than the others. And so I guess I just wondered about methodology, if you could share a little bit about how that kind of plays out in your work and in your approach.
Yeah, great question. Talanoa itself is actually quite a common feature throughout all the Pacific languages now. Tala meaning to talk story, noa meaning the centre. So we're talking story about the centre issue, though we talk a roundabout. So people think we talk roundabout or we talk about nothing, but actually what we're doing is going round and going round the relationship. So we start, like I said, we start with our country, who we're from, our family, our time and space, and that's quite similar across all of the regions that we are from. So over time, in the last probably 3 decades, a lot of Pacific scholarship has gone into these methodologies, and Talanoa has been one of the ones that is quite significantly similar across the different. How we apply it might be different, and the application of it is really down to the cultural protocols of different nations. So for me in Tonga, I don't apply it per se. I go through the people who I've been working with, the Tongans themselves, and they would help me lead what it is that we need to do. The same in Fiji, the same in the Cook Islands, the same in Samoa. I also, even though I speak fluent Samoan, I still work with Samoan leaders there first so that they can do the approach, and they pave the way for us to be able to go in and do our methodologies. The methodologies what we're working on currently that has not been done before is more the analysis. So the method itself is pretty well established now, although not necessarily articulated well. The analysis in terms of the translation, back translation, and getting to the core is what we're actually working through and struggling on now. You're the first to see some of that, so yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you again so much for joining us
You're
today.
welcome.